Well, good morning and welcome to the second in the series of ESG and leading change in professional service firms. ESG is an absolute priority for all of us, and it's essential that it's on every board agenda. In our first event, which was a couple of weeks ago, we looked at understanding the importance of ESG, and we looked at the impact on business in general on the environment and ecosystems. And for professional service firms, one of those big impacts is obviously business travel and what that has on a carbon output. But also as part of that discussion, we focused on what the need is to focus on E, S and the G, so bringing all aspects of ESG into our strategic thinking. We also looked at the high and complex reporting environment and also the direction of travel the government is looking to go in. And again, we'll touch on elements of that both in this session and in the later session. The one, I guess, aspect that I was keen for everyone to take away is that ESG is not an initiative. It's not merely a reporting requirement. It's a real need to embed some new thinking and an ideology into our everyday. We acknowledged also that it's a journey and we'll all be on different paths and we'll all be at different stages of that journey. And therefore, these sorts of forums are really important so that we share experiences that we all progress into the ultimate goal. The previous webinar was recorded, and so if you've missed it or you'd like to refer it on to a colleague, then let the team know and we'll send you the link. In today's webinar, we're looking at creating and embedding ESG strategy, and we're joined, if we can go on to the next slide, please, Mel. And we have two very decent speakers in terms of Nicola Lally, Director of Communications here at BDO, and also my co-chair on our ESG executive. And our ESG executive is effectively an advisory body for our board. Nicola is passionate about ESG, and she's going to share how we've approached creating a strategy here at BDO. And as it says in her short bio underneath, Nicola will cover walking and chewing gum, and also explaining what that means, because I'm still not quite sure, but also how to bake ESG into your strategy. Quite a few food analogies there, so we'll maybe explore that as well, but I'm not sure if we're mixing metaphors. I also welcome Tim. Tim is a partner at ICG and is focused on ESG and sustainability. We work very closely with Tim and his team. And he's going to talk us through his 6 practical steps to implement a successful strategy. And again, give a lot of practical guidelines. There will be time to ask questions at the end. So if you would like to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, I'll pick those up and ask the panelists once they finish their presentations. And if we don't get to all the questions, what we'll do is look to how we can pull those together in an easy format and share those with participants on the call at a later date. And with that, I will pass over to Tim. So Tim, thank you.
Matt, thank you very much indeed. And good morning, everybody. So I'm going to take about 15 minutes to give you my perspective on how you might create and embed an ESG strategy, and also from the perspective of the professional services firms, looking at the clients that you work with. So next slide, please. So I'm going to trot through these sort of 3 areas, discuss a little bit about the complexity around sustainability, and talk about both the risks and increasingly the opportunities. Talk about some of the required action that firms could take in relation to a sustainability strategy and how that might be developed. Next slide, please. But first of all, what are we creating and embedding a strategy for? And these 2 definitions really are the golden thread that comes throughout my thinking around ESG. The top one there really is a higher level philosophical definition. And I think sustainability really starts with our own personal reflections on what it really means for us, for our societies, and for the planet. And the definition underneath takes it down to the level of the enterprise. And we will cover both of these aspects. Next slide, please. And next. So these are just some of the images that have been on our front pages in 2021 from the extreme weather events in North America and Canada, the heat waves and the wildfires, melting ice at the polar, floods in China and Germany, deforestation, and bottom left there was my own experience of climate change and how it drove the conflict in the Darfur region of Western Sudan. And that photograph was taken by a colleague of mine as we flew over a village that had been attacked by a militia. And that really came from the problems caused by the desertification of the Sahara, which brought the nomad tribesmen into conflict with the resident farmers. And that really was what started to drive the Darfur genocide. I then went from that particular village where the destruction and the death was truly awful to a refugee camp, and through my interpreter learned that many of the refugees there would seek to escape, travel across the Sahara with the camel trains and the people traffickers across the Mediterranean up through Europe, and as we have seen in recent months, literally wash up on the shores of Kent. So I really did start to see at that point in the mid-2000s how climate change would have implications for all of us around the world. These images really do remind us that sustainability today is not corporate social responsibility 2.0, and these weather events will ensure that it remains front and center of our agenda. Next slide, please. This is some of the data around sustainability and the implications of climate change. And there is a huge amount of valuable data, and I think it's worth just looking at some of the charts that are out there and really understanding the trends and the implications. Bottom right there is an interesting reflection of the implications that climate change is having on food production and food security, just one of the factors which I think will impact all of us, both as individuals and also our businesses, both directly and indirectly. Next slide, please. Turning to the enterprise level, and the next slide. This is very much becoming a mainstream issue now for businesses. Top left, you've got a chart there which shows just how much climate change is coming to investors' attention, and the increased reference to climate change in quarterly earnings calls. Bottom left, and this is really capturing people's imagination now, it is becoming a legal liability issue for individual chief executives. Top right, there's no doubt that the price of carbon and emitting carbon dioxide is going to rise astronomically in the years ahead. And that is one of the key drivers of the decarbonisation agenda, I think, at the business level. But bottom right there, a chart that shows just how much capital is flowing into sustainability and sustainability fund. There are significant opportunities around sustainability and companies that can demonstrate strong ESG credentials. Next slide, please. This chart shows how over the decades, enterprise value has shifted from tangible assets right through to intangible in the 2020s. And it's reckoned that something like 90% of enterprise value now resides in issues associated with brand and reputation that derived from a company's ability to optimize all forms of capital. And this intangible form of enterprise really does fall into the sustainability basket. How do companies manage their natural capital, social, human, intellectual, and leadership? And this is, I think, a very good slide which explains, why sustainability is so important now for businesses. Next slide. But it's not all about climate change. And this slide and chart is the product of some research conducted by a chap called George Seraphim, who was one of the founding members of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board in San Francisco. And he followed up on some research that was conducted by Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, into 24 significant ESG events that took place in the S&P 500 between 2014 and 2019. And they worked out that those 24 significant ESG events resulted in a market cap loss of $34 billion. So he really carried on that research and looked into thousands of significant ESG events and discovered that actually some of the biggest drivers were around positive and negative customer welfare news and product quality and safety. And companies that did well in these domains could see their share price for listed companies increase by anything up to 5%. And for negative ESG news around those two factors, share price drop by minus 3%. Now, these are for large listed companies in the S&P 500, but it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination to understand how perceived enterprise value would be affected for much smaller companies and indeed those that are privately owned. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do? So here are some issues which really I believe companies must, should, and could do. I won't argue the toss on those that are in the should and could box. People will have different views about the priorities. I would argue strongly that all of those issues should be addressed by companies, and they will be the extent to which a company implements those outcomes will very much depend on the commitment from business leaders and the engagement of the workforce. And there's no doubt that I think enterprise value and stakeholder expectations will be heavily influenced by the extent to which those outcomes are achieved. And as an absolute must, I believe companies need to have a strong ESG governance system. Clearly, they need to comply as an absolute minimum with law and regulation and that which is coming into force, and to prepare for significant climate events. Next slide, please. And the next one. So this is my perspective on how companies could create and embed an ESG strategy. And I will talk you through each of these 6 steps now. And it's not just about your own company having this strategy, but as professional services firms, it's a way of looking at your clients and asking the question, have they addressed the issues which I will now come on to describe? Next slide, please. So the first step is to really conduct an assessment of the resilience of the business. Look at the centers of gravity, ask the question, has the company positioned itself for various disruption scenarios through the social, technological, economic, environmental, and political domains? And does it have an action plan for positioning itself for those future disruptions? And conducting this step up front ensures that further consideration of sustainability is rooted in the core business function, and we don't lose sight of what it is the company does to generate revenue. It's also, incidentally, the outcomes of this sort of exercise, and typically they take place over a 1 or 2 day workshop with engagement from a number of people working for the firm. It provides evidence that can be used later during the discovery and the disclosure phase of ESG performance. But this just keeps front and center of mind that we want the company in question to be surviving and thriving in the long term, not just the short term. Next slide, please. I bring this slide up because I have worked with a number of companies that have made some pretty outrageous claims in terms of their sustainability performance. And there is considerable reputation and increasingly legal risk now around greenwashing. So this is low-hanging fruit. Look around at what the company is saying and make sure that any claim around sustainability and ESG can be backed up with data and is not in fact something which is a spurious claim, because it will come back to bite the company. And this is activity that is concurrent throughout the steps, but it's worth focusing minds very early on the jeopardy around greenwashing, that people need to be very vigilant. And sometimes it's just about ensuring that really stupid things are not taking place. Next step, please. This is where the heavy lifting is done, and it really is where the ESG performance of a company is audited. Now, there are many frameworks that provide guidance on how this might be done. This particular slide here summarizes the approach used by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is now merged in to become the Value Reporting Foundation. And it describes sustainability in 5 dimensions, noting that ESG really is shorthand for sustainability. And in the right-hand column there are 26 universal performance indicators. And behind each of those performance indicators are a series of protocols and questions that companies will need to answer. But they'll answer the questions and address the protocols that are materially relevant to that particular business in that particular sector. And SASB is ruthless about focusing on materiality so as not to create too much of a burden around discovery and disclosure. There are a number of frameworks available. TCFD is one that people may be very familiar with in the real estate, GRESB, B Corporation. And one of the conversations to have, and we may touch on it in questions later, is what framework for ESG accounting is the one that best suits the company in question. But this takes a lot of time. It takes considerable engagement from the workforce, and it's extremely important that this is done accurately in order to avoid claims around or criticism around greenwashing. This will then provide a baseline of data. Next slide, please. Having conducted the audit, it's then worth asking the question, well, so what does this mean? And this is where there is a requirement to look at the data and to conduct any action in relation to remediation, but also see opportunities to innovate. And I've used the same must, should, and could do framework. As an absolute must, companies need to know where they are. They need to be complying with law and regulation and policy, and compare with what's going on with their competitors, baseline across the particular industry, because a lot of insights will exist there. But that really is the floor as an absolute minimum. In terms of should be doing, I put there in parenthesis, apply subtractive thinking. So think about stuff that companies should stop doing in order to cut costs, recycle, and streamline systems to become more efficient. And then obviously moving into the could do, and this is where investment may be required in order to create new capabilities and for the company to transform and to continue to adapt along with the principles of sustainability. Next slide, please. And then having done that, it was time to think about gaining third-party assurance around sustainability performance. Now, this can be done concurrently with the framework that is being used for auditing, and some of those, such as B Corporation in the middle there and GRESB top left, you will get the assurance at the same time as you do the discovery and the disclosure. It's kind of built in. SASB is a self-disclosure system, and therefore it may be required that you go out and get third-party assurance from somebody else. Companies such as Sustainalytics will be scraping the internet and all sources of information to just verify that the data that's being disclosed is in fact accurate. Next slide, please. So this is a crucial step, which is really having understood where your ESG performance data is. You then do a mapping of the human terrain in really some considerable detail to understand in the right-hand ellipsis there, what are the stakeholders that would influence the business in one way or another. And then it's a case of taking the ESG performance data and compiling an honest, transparent, and credible narrative that is then communicated in a very sophisticated way to each of those stakeholders in a way that means something to them. It's a very basic slide. You'll understand the concept that I'm talking about here, but this really speaks to Professor Robert Schiller's concept of narrative economics. If you tell a story and you can tell it well, then it will improve and enhance perceptions of enterprise value. And think back to that earlier slide that George Seraphim is researching, where good and bad news ESG stories will have a significant implication for enterprise value. Next slide, please. And finally, but I would argue actually that step 6 really is the first step, is to internalize and institutionalize the ESG capability within the firm. I use the term here ESG committee. There may be a better term than committee. You want something that frankly has executive authority with a clear purpose, such as becoming the center of excellence for sustainability thinking, to provide another lens through which business decisions can be taken, aligns the firm's purpose, values, and vision with the principles of sustainability, such as those relevant UN Sustainable Development Goals that would apply to that particular business sector. It implements the firm's ESG strategy, which are these 6 steps that I've been talking about, and owns the ESG narrative. Highlights ESG risks, any greenwashing, but also seizes opportunities for innovation, and generally contributes to the ongoing change and transformation agenda in a firm. Structurally, I think it's important to mainstream sustainability. Don't put it into a silo. I've put there reports to the board. There is an element of risk and compliance about sustainability, so separating from the chief executive's direct authority may be worth considering. I think it sends a certain message to stakeholders that could be useful. resourced to seize opportunities and not just reside in the compliance silo. Internal and external core business functions represented. I put their joint venture partners included. It may be worth getting people from the supply chain and value chain inside the tent at an early stage, so you're all singing off the same hymn sheet. And obviously, it has the authority to delegate because a lot of detailed work will be required. Some thoughts there around what the membership of that body might look like. I would like to emphasize the importance of a strong and credible leader who can speak honestly to the board and have some of those uncomfortable conversations, because that's where the real value of sustainability lies. It needs to be connected, just as and well connected to the internal business community as the external one, and obviously an ethos that is very much open-minded and data-driven. Next slide, please. It's also worth focusing an element of the ESG committee or that sustainability body on the importance of thinking to the future. And this slide here really speaks to the concept of an ESG knowledge hub. And that is where people are specifically asked to consider what developments may be taking place in the sort of 5 to 10 year time horizon. And at the four polls there, future issues around developing law, regulation and policy, science and technology innovations, geopolitical strategic shocks, and anthropological trends, which, if you're keeping a weather eye on those issues, will help the company position for associated risks and opportunities. I've highlighted there in the sort of the northwest quadrant there, COP26. I think this is going to be a significant event, and it's worth probably asking somebody to carefully track what is coming out of COP26, and indeed in the weeks that lead up to it, because government is moving quickly to roll out legislation and regulation in order to be seen politically to be walking the walk as well as talking the talk. Look at what's happening at the emissions trading scheme markets. That will be a good pointer as to where future carbon prices will be going, and obviously a number of other issues there that would have an implication for the business. Next slide, please. So if you've tackled those 6 steps, that should have moved from the amber color, which we started with, to a green now, which would indicate that the company is on top of the sustainability agenda. I would be reluctant to declare victory, because many of the black swans that the company may have to contend with will reside in the ESG domain. But at least if there is a strong ESG governance system in place and it is tackling those 6 steps, then you should be able to sleep a little more easily at night. And I will end on that point and now hand over to Nicola.
Thank you very much to Tim. And here's the test as to whether our reality at BDO in getting our arms around ESG matches Tim's best practice theory, and I'm hoping it will. I'm going to start actually with one of my favourite quotes, which is from the former co-head of sustainability at Unilever. And she said, we have 9 years to fix something quite spectacular, with extraordinary complex internal intentions, but it takes a long time to learn how to do it, to strengthen your business rather than undermine it. And that last bit was the mindset with which we went into planning our ESG strategy. It has to be about strengthening our business rather than undermining it. Next slide, please. Certainly from our experience at BDO of getting our arms around ESG, it's a case of what I refer to as walking and chewing gum at the same time. If there are any Daniel Kahneman fans out there, you'll also know this as thinking both fast and slow. Because ESG is billed as the issue of this generation, where we have to think slowly and deeply, but also act swiftly. And the topic is huge. It's complex, it's global, it will impact and be impacted by all teams. And so the answer needs to be collaborative. All of us will be a work in progress on ESG for many years. And so we need to get comfortable as business leaders about how we can act deeply, but also swiftly for the long term. So we started to think about that as 2 modes that we needed in our business. The first was strategic. This is when we're in fact-finding mode. This is how we started to build our evidence case about what ESG meant for us as a business. It started to build the longer-term strategic discussions we needed to have. It's where we gathered evidence, where we built our working hypotheses, where we mapped out where we currently were, but also what our ambitions and visions were. This is the area where we were considering what sort of executive education do we need to coach ourselves, but also board members on the complex decision making that ESG certainly requires. And that's what helped us towards our vision, our ambition, and our risk appetite. And critically, it's a really interesting test of how strong your values and your corporate purpose is, and how deep those leaders' commitments to those go. The second was the tactical mode, and this is when we're in connecting and storytelling mode. It was really important for us early on to recognise we're already doing so much tactically in many of the E, S, and G spaces. It was just that we hadn't looked at it, challenged it, or promoted it through a specific ESG lens before. There will already be many policies you have, programs you have in place, subject matter experts you have or know you need, and many, many passionate people whose energy you need to positively harness. So a significant part of ESG is how to ensure they are all linked up, how they are all additive and promoted appropriately. And that's where coordination and communication can add real strength into the business. The final couple of slides I have share focus more on mode 1, the strategic mode, as it was that early thinking and board level influence that then set the tone for the tactical implementation. So next slide, please. Because ESG is complex and it's long term and it will require challenging conversations or decision making, it's important for us to have high level conversations with some of those decision makers to ensure that everyone is approaching ESG from the same starting point. So we came up with our ESG principles that are sort of quite big philosophical statements that are right for us as our firm as we approached our ESG planning. I'll step through them quickly, working across the top row first, as some of these may chime with you and the discussions you're having with your internal stakeholders. Firstly, that ESG matters. That's the business imperative that we needed everyone to understand, and that it matters to our people, to our clients, to society, to our senior leaders, and to future generations. That needed to be an undeniable truth. Then we talked a lot about how we needed to understand and tackle ESG positively and proactively, so it doesn't undermine our business, but rather strengthens it. And that strength came from evidencing how ESG can drive growth, mitigate risk, create more trust, and lower cost. And we created an evidence pack to show why all of those were true. We also knew we needed to adopt a long-term, paced and sustainable way to really bake ESG into our business for at least the next 9 years, if not longer. But we also need to keep adopting changes and take swift action where we can to make a difference. On the middle row, we also wanted to recognise that we will be a work in progress on ESG for a long time to come. And we don't shy away from that. We want to be open and transparent about where we are on all of those different journeys, and where we're committed to do the next right thing in order to keep progressing. We also knew that our ESG response needed to be grounded in commercial reality and ROI. ESG is, of course, a business opportunity as much as it is a business risk. We're not a social enterprise. We're not a manufacturing firm. And so we had to work out what was the right commercial decisions for us and make sure that any big, bold statements actually matched with commercial realities. We also needed all of our decision makers to realise that society sets the bar on a lot of ESG matters, not us. And that's particularly important if some of your decision makers are particularly of a compliance mindset or a solely operational mindset. And we'll be asking, why do we need to do more than we're legally obliged to do? But because society sets the bar on ESG, we needed an ESG approach that is very consistent but has some flexibility. And the clearly defined frameworks that Tim was mentioning earlier certainly help as an anchor for some of that decision making. And we also had a lot of conversations about why ESG is not just nice to have on a Friday CSR stories, but actually it's how businesses are and will be seen as a responsible business, to earn them a license to operate and a permission to succeed. That was particularly important for us in terms of laying out the burning platform as to why ESG was important. And then on the bottom row, ESG is more than just carbon. ESG is big, it's complex. Certainly not everyone on your decision-making list will be familiar with aspects of ESG yet. And therefore, we need to understand and help educate, but really prioritize as to where it's right to put our focus as our business. We knew we weren't starting with a blank sheet, but we needed to order our actions and the stories of our chapter in a way that makes sense, achieved positive impact, but also built pride. The next box is full of dilemmas. There's a quote that's commonly associated with ESG, which is this: all your actions either contribute to the problem or contribute to the solution. But to work out which is not as straightforward as that binary phrase suggests, because ESG is full of dilemmas. A great example I heard recently is if a company was really serious about the world's carbon emissions, it would recognize that the biggest impact on our planet is our population. So they would have a terrible parental leave policy to discourage staff from having children. So what works on the E side might not work for the S side in ESG. So it really is full of dilemmas. And the final two boxes, continuing to embed ESG into our decision making will necessitate challenging conversations at times. And we needed our leadership team and our partnership council to recognize that ESG is about metrics. Sometimes that will mean targets, other times benchmarks, other times simply better data capture. But the right metrics at the right time can force the right change. And it's critical to go into planning ESG strategies with that understanding. And finally, we can't do this alone. So many of the E, S, and G agendas are global, and they require global collaborative efforts. So partnerships, in their broadest sense, not financial model sense, are imperative to success. As global firms, as professional services firms across an industry, working together would certainly achieve a more positive outcome. Next slide, please. And finally, once we'd looked at the principles with which we would approach the ESG decision making, we could identify the building blocks of our ESG strategy, which are summarized here. Counterintuitively, they go anti-clockwise on the slide, so I'll do the same, starting on the top left. For us, it started with embedding ESG into our decision making at both strategy and operational levels. And that meant simply spending time with our leadership team, partnership council, our culture board and our operations board to discuss the business case for why ESG should be a priority, and helping them start to see the impacts and next actions. Happily for us, there was unanimous support. Secondly, given the G in ESG stands for governance, we need to govern our ESG decisions, communications, and education in a very transparent and signature way. We knew we needed an appropriate ESG governance model. We reviewed how our internal governance was structured already. So where could this sit within our current structure? And also how other companies were approaching this. For us, it was absolutely right to have our most senior partner in the firm, in Matthew White, as the exec sponsor for ESG. And happily, he actually approached us to volunteer, which is always a happy starting point. We also then knew it was right for us to dedicate an ESG executive to act as an advisory group to our leadership team. And members of that ESG executive represent strategy, operations, global, clients and markets, ethics, and communications. And importantly, we specifically put an employee voice onto that group, which is a rotating seat for 6 months from one of our internal cultural champions. The third part of how we were building our strategy is around clients and markets. There are, of course, market opportunities on ESG and sustainability in terms of upskilling our teams to have rounded business conversations, but also selling specific sustainability services. And so we recognized we needed an ESG growth plan. So we have a strategic, go-to-market, commercially grounded approach that considers our sector expertise, our technical understanding, and our global capabilities, but that also we were walking the walk internally as well as talking the talk externally. The fourth part of building our strategy was we needed to choose the right ESG framework to help our internal decision making, our risk assessments, our prioritization, our reporting, and our communications that was right for the type of firm we are. As Tim mentioned, there are, of course, many ESG standards to choose from. And so we needed to better understand those so that we could choose the right ESG framework for us. Because we could then use it for number 5, which was to help us to prioritize, to work out where we should best divert our energies to achieve change and to articulate our value to society over a sustained period of time. The ESG frameworks, the materiality assessments that Tim mentioned were really key to helping with that prioritization. Number 6, as I specialize in communications, you may expect me to say this, but we knew we needed an ongoing ESG communications and education program, both internally and externally. For us, this started with identifying what our ESG strategic narrative is. That is what our core position and how to articulate that. And then turn that narrative into really practical crib sheets for our teams to use so that they felt fluent in talking to contacts, clients, and teams about that. It also includes a program of education for our support staff and our operational leaders so that they can begin to shift their behaviours and consider the impact that ESG prominence has on their decisions. And it will be through that sustained education that we start to bake it into our business. For example, holding a conversation with our IT leads about how to think about technology waste or website accessibility, or our marketing leads about sustainable merchandise, or facilities leads about waste reduction. There are so many different layers to having all of those conversations, and it needs a determined strategy to do that. And the final part of how we were building our ESG strategy recognised that we're a major firm of a $10 billion global organisation. So we needed to be an active supporter, member and influencer of that BDO global ESG approach. And to achieve that, we then sit on a number of different working groups globally to ensure that we're all acting in line and tackling global agendas in a global way. Our ESG exec is now just 5 meetings old, but we've been able to make great progress in each of those strategic areas in a way that is aimed to strengthen our business and to help us get our arms around ESG. That's it from me. I'm now going to pass back to Matt.
Thanks, Nicola, and thank you both for really great insight, both in terms of, I guess, the overall structure of frameworks, but also some of the practicalities of putting it in place. So just to remind everybody, we do have a Q&A function down below, so we've got some questions that are coming through. If you've got further questions, please just post them on the Q&A, and I will try and pick them up as we go. But the first one, Tim, coming into you. To yourself, you mentioned there are a number of frameworks that we could utilise from a disclosure point of view. How should organisations go around about choosing that? Again, we've gone through our own deliberations, but it'd be interesting for, I guess, the people on the call to understand actually what factors should they start to consider.
Thanks, Matt. There are, as you say, a number of frameworks. I think if you were to construct a Venn diagram, and onto that Venn diagram, place all of the various performance indicators that each of the frameworks requires disclosure around, you would see the vast majority, probably 85%, sit in the middle. I think it's a case of thinking about the business sector that you reside in, and then picking the framework where the majority of performance indicators sit, where it's most relevant and material to your firm. But it's not just a case of going with one particular framework, because that's, if you like, a sort of a minimum requirement. it's then important to think through what are all the factors which have a bearing on the company's sustainability performance, and what do the different stakeholders think. A lot of companies are directed to use a particular framework. If they're an international firm, head office, wherever that might be, will have a view, and that just sets the agenda for the rest of the company. Investors are having a very strong view about which framework companies should use as well. So it's always worth checking with investors, but do that sort of mind mapping exercise with a Venn diagram as the sort of the mental model, and just see which framework suits your firm best. There's also a conversation to be had around the assurance piece. Because certain frameworks, have an assurance component with them, but they tend to be very expensive. So there is a cost implication, particularly for those small and medium-sized enterprises.
Brilliant, thank you. And Nicola, one for you. What's the toughest part of creating and embedding an ESG strategy in terms of a professional service firm?
Thank you, Matt. I would say the pace, getting the pace right, because you're dealing with some really complex long-term decisions, but you're also dealing with a lot of swift responses on different agendas. Working out what that right pace is tough. It can feel like suddenly there are lots of popcorns popping, and people are like moths to a flame when something new comes up. And anytime someone saw ESG in the title of anything, it would inevitably end up in my inbox. So getting the pace of setting up a strategy that is baked into the business and into the mindsets of each leader as to how they want to run their bit of the business, that requires time, debate and energy, but you also need to work out how to respond on the different agendas quite quickly. So I think pace is the toughest one. And my tip would be get lots of good people working on it with you.
And how do you judge? I actually wrote down a question when you were talking, actually. So this is my question to you. So how do you judge if you're getting pace right? And I'll come to you afterwards, Tim. So just give you a bit of heads up. Because obviously there is a lot of slow thinking that you need to do to make sure you don't overpromise and then underdeliver. But for some, it's just not fast enough. For some, it is way too fast because we've not done enough thinking. So how do you judge if that pace is right? How do you take that? What sense of feedback do you take for that?
Yeah, so we started off by spending time first defining what our vision is on ESG. So on the spectrum of where businesses could be on ESG, what is right for us in 5 years' time as BDO. And that it was important to do that because that then helps you to set the pace. It helps you to identify what are the real big ticket items that you need to address. For example, decreasing your carbon footprints, for example, reviewing your social impact that you have, for example, looking at your ESG risk landscape, for example, your sustainability procurement strategy, and you identify those key things, and then you can plot your pace on those. That was important because it then allowed us to talk to all of the different stakeholders about what our ambitions were and be transparent about where we could move quickly and where we couldn't move quickly. And the reason I'm answering the question in that order is because being transparent about how you're approaching it helps to build trust. It helps to bring people on the journey with you so that they can understand just because a particular scheme has been launched this week doesn't mean that we automatically jump on it, because it has to be part of a very long, complex agenda. And building that trust and transparency in your approach will certainly help you with the conversations about, are you moving fast enough? Are you moving too fast? That certainly helps. Then the feedback is critical. Because society sets the bar on ESG and not us, how we horizon scan on how other people are responding, how some of the government regulations are changing, all of that horizon scanning helps us to work out if our pace is right. And then listening to our employees, listening to our partners about what's on their minds. What are those agendas that really bother them, but also that would really build pride. And so we have lots of different mechanics at BDO around how we listen to our employee voice, so that that's a really good test of our pacing.
Brilliant. Tim, any observations in terms of how you judge pace?
Well, to use that cliche, it is a marathon rather than a sprint. So whatever is done needs to endure, because the point about sustainability is that we're taking our eye off the short term and looking at the long term. How is the business going to thrive and survive in the 10, 20, 30-year time horizon? I think it's always worth, going with the grain of a firm's culture, so that what you do set up is going to be sustainable. I think in terms of specific activities, if you think back to that slide I put up about things that a firm must, should, and could do, there is a clear list of prioritized actions that really can't wait. First of all, I would say put in place a governance system that can oversee this, and then as an absolute minimum, just make sure that you are in compliance with law and regulation. I mean, that drives immediate activity, or at least it could do if you're not compliant. And I would certainly say, as a matter of urgency, make sure that the business is positioned for significant, weather events that are coming to a place near you in the short term. And then there are other things which I think will just naturally pop into the rhythm and tempo of the business's life cycle.
Brilliant. Another one for you, Tim. So obviously there's loads of tools around that firms can employ to adopt to the ESG strategic reviews. How best can professional service firms employ those tools?
Well, I would, those 6 steps I described, they really also serve as a checklist. So it's not just about starting from ground zero and building up, but also you can reverse engineer it and think of it as a way to conduct a maturity curve assessment. And when you look at companies and clients, ask yourself a series of questions around those 6 steps. What does its resilience piece look like? That will obviously reach into the risk and compliance sector. Is there any greenwashing going on? Have they conducted a thorough audit and disclosed it? What have they done about it in terms of not just remediation, but also seizing opportunities? Is it assured? What's their communication plan? So I think that the tools really fall into those baskets, those 6 baskets, as a useful checklist when you're looking at the company that you're working with as a professional services firm. And I think the whole point about sustainability for the professional services sector, it's a great way to add value to your clients, above and beyond what it is that you may be engaged to do on a narrow front, but really helps you differentiate from your competitors in the professional services landscape, to be able to say, look, we have just noticed these other issues in relation to sustainability, which could be, I think, extremely helpful.
And just coming back to greenwashing, so we obviously it's a term that's getting bandied around quite a lot at the moment. I'm just wondering, from your experience, have you come across much greenwashing, and is it either deliberate or just, I guess, amateur errors?
I have come across a lot, and the vast majority is carelessness. It's carelessness around claims that can be substantiated, with 1 or 2 clicks when you're doing some research, but the 3rd click, it all goes blank, and there is just no evidence. It's fairly straightforward, I think, to be honest, and you will have a handle on, those direct actions in relation to ESG, the things that you control. So in terms of emissions, those scope 1 and scope 2, the problems and the challenges come with scope 3. And what is going on in the supply and the value chains. That's where the real risk lies, and where people, I think, now have to be increasingly vigilant, because even if your own house is in order, if you're being supplied by a supplier that has unethical practices or a significant polluter, then then that risk and that jeopardy is going to pass to the company, and you're going to have to deal with the fallout of that. So most of it is unintended. But is increasingly, ignorance is no defense nowadays, I think, and that issue is going to become increasingly acute. Thank you.
I've got a question come up which I'll throw to Nicola, which is environmental gets a lot of coverage, and obviously with COP26 at the moment, pretty much daily headlines. What are the key issues from a professional services firm point of view in the non-environmental perspective?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and we spent a good amount of time working out what are the priority agendas for us as an accountancy and business advisory firm, and where could we have the most positive impact. And that was a really important aspect to the debate. We established that on the environment, we have to do what is expected of us, and we have to ensure that we keep up with those expectations, be those employee expectations, client expectations, regulatory requirements, but that we are a people-powered business. We have 6,000 people. What we do is train vital business and financial skills in people. So therefore, for us, how we have the best social impact is a really critical debate. And again, so we spent lots of time thinking about that. There are very obvious current agendas on which businesses need to respond and need to have strategies under social. Certainly ED&I, which is equality, diversity and inclusion, are important. Well-being is important, obviously, coming through COVID, and also what we term citizenship. So how do we help our people be the best corporate citizens that they can be? So I'd say those are the three major social agendas that when we look at horizon scanning, when we look at what the business media cover, when we look at employee survey material, those are the key social agendas as to how we treat our workforce.
Brilliant, thank you. And Tim, one for you. So in terms of, there's obviously lots of organisations are doing lots of things at the moment, and obviously with the ultimate aim that we're all aligned in terms of either reducing carbon or making from an impact on a social point of view. How do we learn from each other so that there's not duplication of effort?
Well, in terms of a company's internal approach to sustainability, it's very important to note that a lot of the activity that's taking place at the moment around sustainability may well be happening in some other part of the business. So, for example, if you're looking at assessing the resilience of a firm, it's not about redesigning the wheel. It's simply perhaps looking at what's on the risk register at the moment, involving the chief risk officer in all of this, maybe questioning whether sufficient attention is being placed on the practicing of a company's response to resilience, but really to capture all the good work that's going on and recognize that it may well be falling into that broader sustainability basket, in which case, no, use it. Do not repeat good work that's going on elsewhere, but simply bring it into the sustainability umbrella, included as part of the narrative when disclosing and communicating to your stakeholders about what the firm is doing. So internally, look at everything that's going on and just make a decision, I think, about whether it actually does fall into the sustainability basket, and then leverage around that. And in terms of externally, one of the functions of that ESG governance board is to be connected with the wider ESG community and with other thought leaders in the sector to learn, off each other. And again, I think this is one of those topics where we can afford to just rise above the day-to-day competitive behaviors and try and collaborate, because we've all got to inhabit the same world and deal with the same issues, and we will not achieve what we really need to if we don't have that cooperation and collaboration.
And certainly that's one of the points that we took to our leadership team and partnership council, where some of the criticism was actually, BDO in itself is not going to change the world, but actually if we all do it and we all work together, then that's absolutely where you make the impact. And so that does resonate with myself. Nicola, a quick question for yourself. So any bear traps that you would like to share in terms of that we may have fallen into in our path?
Yes, we're all learning something new, so there will be bear traps. I have needed to constantly remind myself that this takes an army, a global army, to achieve over many years. It isn't an agenda that can be fixed with a nicely designed slide deck or a good agenda. That you will need experts, lots of them, lots of external ones to really challenge your thinking, to add that independent level of thinking and challenge, but also internal ones who know their bit of the business really well, excuse me, but who also start to understand what ESG is about. So the bear traps to avoid would be thinking that ESG can be solved by giving the responsibility to one person or one executive, by thinking that it will be fixed with lots of good intention. That has to be matched with investment of time, of resource, of money. And then I would encourage you to build your coalitions as to how you're going to start making this through lots of different people's thinking, not just your own.
Brilliant. And Tim, any bear traps that you're aware of?
Well, it relates really to support what Nicola has said. I think it's recognizing there won't be a short-term quick fix on this. And quite how we break the cycle of short-term thinking, the pressure that chief executives are under to conform to the quarterly earnings calls, and just how that drives behavior is really an unhelpful tension when it comes to thinking in the long term. So trying to get outside of the short-term decision cycle and thinking long term and investing accordingly is, I would say, well, failing to do that is probably where the bear trap is. Thinking this is going to be a quick fix, it is absolutely not, and it's very complicated and difficult and quite boring stuff at times. And having the right mindset going into it, I think, will help firms avoid what I consider to be the most significant bear trap, which is discounting the importance of the future.
Brilliant, thank you. And we just got most probably time for just one quick question, which I'll go to Nicola again. So should professional service firms help clients seeking to undertake, I guess, activity that's not environmentally friendly? And I know that's something that we've been deliberating internally as well.
Yeah, definitely. We've talked a lot about that in terms of a really big question. What should the impact of ESG prominence be on our client portfolio? And so we have taken that question to lots of different groups to test the thinking of that internally. And the conclusion of all of those discussions is that it's a hard question, and that it's full of dilemmas, and it is not a binary answer. So our conclusion, which again we're kind of still testing with people, is it is very difficult to say all of that sector is really bad and all of that sector is really good, and therefore on our own moral compass we'll work with that but not with that. It's very challenging to get to that multinational view on that. So I would recommend that you look on it as a case-by-case basis and recognise that all of those clients, all of those businesses will also be having the same conversations about what their ESG approach is. And the majority of businesses will want to do better, they will want to improve, and therefore we can have a role in helping them to do that. Brilliant,
thank you. As you say, full of dilemmas. So I'm afraid that's we're pretty much running out of time now in terms of the session. So thank you both to Tim and to Nicola. Really great insight. I thoroughly enjoyed it. In terms of, I guess, some of the takeaways for me, when Tim was talking about the enterprise value and brand and reputation, ESG is going to play such a fundamental part in terms of that brand and reputation. It's not just important in terms of winning business, but certainly in professional services, it's important in terms of the talent war. And if you're not addressing ESG, you will lose that war without a doubt, in my mind. Also, in terms of the must, should, could, I thought was interesting. Today in BHP was in the Financial Times being criticised about their ESG strategy, which I thought was quite interesting, because I think the external influence on what should and could be done is most probably going to merge and become slightly more difficult to determine, because there's going to be so many external factors pushing on that. And then from Nicola, the key thing that we keep saying internally is that actually ESG strategy is about strengthening our business, and it's not undermining it. So it's really making sure that we are fit for the future. With that, thanks again to Tim and to Nicola. We have, in a couple of weeks' time, the next webinar, which is on reporting and tracking progress, which is on screen now. So please feel free to register. And thank you very much for your time this morning. Thanks very much.